Welcome back. We are about to have another edition of What's in the Textbook. Today, we're going to look at Chapter 5. So you may be thinking, Chapter 5, that's what we read after Chapter 4? And you would be wrong. Chapter 5 is read out of sequence. Chapter 5 is a chapter that looks at the authoritarian side of the course. So what we end up doing is we've studied the introduction, we've studied chapter 1 and 2. That gives us an overview of the term ideology and the ideas of individualism and collectivism. From there we looked at chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 6 and chapter 8, and to some extent chapter 12 and 9 as we studied economic individualism. Now we're about to look at the collectivism side, both economically and politically, because you guessed it, chapter 5 is a turnaround chapter, meaning once we're done chapter 5, we're going to be moving from the economic unit into the political unit. You could easily make the argument chapter 5 is the most important chapter of the year in the sense of just how much content is in this chapter. By the end of the chapter, you should be able to economically explore and describe collectivism in the USSR, and you should be able to explore and describe the economic system in Nazi Germany. Additionally, you should be able to explore both of them politically as well. So let's get started. One thing I'd like to remind you is about the spectrum and just where these case studies would fall in the spectrum. So at the beginning of the year, we looked at a spectrum and we talked about a quadrant. And we suggested to you that it's not as simple as just as a straight line. A quadrant, look at me, I'm writing in a book and everything's going to be upside down, backwards to you, so I don't even know why I'm doing this. But if you have freedom and freedom, so political freedom plus economic freedom, then that would be democratic capitalism. That's America. If you have political freedom but economic control, you'd have democratic socialism. And we tend to teach that that's the Swedish or Norwegian or Finnish or Danish model. That might be incorrect. They're not as socialist as we pretend they are, but for the simplicity's sake, that's what we teach. If you have economic control and political control, if you have authoritarian socialism, that's going to be communism. And that's what we're going to look at today. If you have political control, authoritarian, but economic freedom, you still have capitalism, then guess what you have? You have fascism. So what do fascism and communism have in common? They're both authoritarian political states. What do they have in contrast? Well, fascism, at least in theory, has more economically in common with the United States than it has with the USSR. So let's get started with Chapter 5. So again, I might meander our way through Chapter 5 a few times because it's worth a read to look for the Soviet Union story, but it's also worth a read to look for Nazi Germany's story. And while you're looking at both of the stories, it's important to distinguish between the economic side of the story and the political side. So when we read through the textbook and we look at the Soviet Union story economically, the textbook talks about a key question is, why? Why did communism come to Russia? Why did it come to Russia? Well, the social, political, and economic unrest that causes a revolution begins to be described on page 164 when they talk about the Bloody Sunday. And Bloody Sunday is this protest against the Tsarist regime, against the feudalistic order. And as a consequence of Bloody Sunday, what happened was the Cossack troops that are defending the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, which will change names a few times in the 20th century, those Imperial Guard troops that fire upon the crowd, by firing upon the crowd, the protesters in the crowd become radicalized, and then they end up losing that connection to their czar. They're like, wow, our czar isn't really, he doesn't have our best interest. So this is a moment, an epiphany, where the protesters, who were simply, they were asking their father figure of their country for food because they're hungry, now become more radicalized because they understand the Tsar doesn't have their best interests. And therefore, they need to try something more radical, hence communism. Communism will also come to Russia because of World War I. In World War I, the Russians do quite poorly. And while they're doing poorly, the Tsar goes and leaves the Kremlin and goes and wants to play the part of general. And while he's generaling, he leaves his German Tsarina in charge of the Kremlin. And wait a minute, I thought we're fighting against the Germans. So there's a big conspiracy in Moscow about how the government's been compromised and how maybe the Tsarina is under the control of this monk, Rasputin, and the people begin to become quite paranoid. And maybe most importantly, they're hungry. So there's economic reasons, there's social reasons, there's political reasons, there's been a stagnation. They haven't had the French Revolution yet, and it's the 20th century. The French had it in the 18th century. So there's many reasons why communism comes to the Soviet Union. And that's an important concept to think about when you're looking at the chapter, because one part of the chapter is under what circumstances would people desire authoritarianism? You know, when would you desire authoritarianism? What conditions would convince people that to, in this case, revolt in favor of an authoritarian communist state? And what did Lenin promise them? Peace, land, and bread. So what allowed communism to come to the Soviet Union? A lack of peace, land, and bread. So something to look forward to when you read through it. Because the chapter is comparing communism and fascism, it doubles down and goes back to the terms radical and reactionary. Now, once again, fascism's a reactionary ideology because they're trying to go back, right? Mussolini's trying to go back and reestablish the glory of Rome. And Hitler's trying to go back to some kind of mythical Teutonic lore of the Aryan people, not realizing the Aryan people are Persian, they're Iranian, and Roman, like Roma people, and that's not German. But he's a little lost. So reactionary is, let's go back to an idealized past. Radical, let's go to something new. It's a rejection of the past. It's a rejection of the present. It's let's try something new. Communism's that. It's classlessness. It's egalitarianism. It's a dictatorship of the proletariat. We haven't done that yet. It's radical. So both radicals and reactionaries in chapter 5, we're going to see that at times they end up doing things that are very similar. So Mussolini will say everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. And that's an emphasis of authoritarian power, of totalitarian power. The state has total control over your life. Stalin wouldn't disagree with that quote. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Stalin is just would argue, at least in theory, if people are listening, he would say that the purpose behind totalitarianism is to unlock egalitarianism. That we're doing this so that everybody in the future can be equal. Whereas fascists would say we're doing this so that we can, as a nation, become mightier and unlock natural inequality. So whereas communists are trying to create a future of equality, fascists see the world as a world of unequals. And the strong must prey upon the weak. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, right? Natural selection, social Darwinism, all those great things mixed into fascism. So the textbook begins with some political stuff, right? So we've been studying economics, but it begins with political stuff. That can be frustrating if you're reading it page to page. But some of the political stuff that they mention, you're really going to be tested on it a lot in multiple choice and in A1s. And potentially you can you can weave it into your story of your essay. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about techniques of dictatorship. So when we say authoritarian governments politically, what does that mean for citizens? Well, it means that they're going to be subject to secret police and terror and indoctrination and propaganda, and there will be youth groups, and there's going to be redirecting of popular discontent. There's going to be scapegoats. There's going to be purges. There's going to be a cult of the leader. There's going to be a one-party state. There's going to be, all of these techniques that dictators use to at first seize power. You're going to need a military force to seize power. You're going to need propaganda to seize power. You're going to probably use pageantry to seize power. You're going to use indoctrination to have those minions to help you seize power. But once you have power, how do you maintain it? So the techniques of dictatorship are both to seize and to maintain non-liberal, aka authoritarian political power. That's how it fits into the course. So the textbook introduces the terms, and it's not only enough to know what propaganda is, it's important to be able to identify it on a test. It's not enough to understand what scapegoating is. You need to be able to give an example. You need to understand how Adolf Hitler used his Holocaust, his genocide of the Jewish people, as a redirection of popular discontent, that they were scapegoated, much like Stalin will scapegoat the kulaks. So then the textbook takes a step back and tells you a little bit more of the story of how communism comes to Russia. Again, read it once, but you don't need to memorize it. This is not a history course, and it's not a course on, if it was on history, it's not a course on that history. That history was taught in Social 20. What you need to, for this course, is understand just, how did communism come to Russia? Peace, land, and bread. People were radicalized after the Bloody Sunday. They radicalized after that. The political system was stagnant. It was obsolete. It was based on feudalism that much of the rest of Europe had already moved away from for the last 2 centuries. We also had an economic system that wasn't producing enough food for the people during the time of war, and socially there was an awakening that they were their value was predetermined by the lottery of birth, and they didn't agree that there wasn't an opportunity to better themselves socially and economically. Not that communism is going to provide that, but it made them rethink the order of the day. So then the textbook goes into how the Nazis come to power. And again, it's important to understand, under what circumstances, especially for the Nazis, because for the Russian people, they go from authoritarianism to authoritarianism. They go from a czar, which has absolute power, the divine right? I am the czar because I was born into this, right? So they go from authoritarianism to authoritarianism. Not as significant. But for the Germans, they go from authoritarianism to a democracy, back to authoritarianism. So the question should be asked, why would they do that? Why did they turn their backs on democracy? But take a long story short, the reason why democracy doesn't work in Germany is because of the way democracy was established in Germany. Democracy is forced upon the Germans as a consequence of World War I. So as a consequence of World War I, the Kaiser abdicates. He was their absolute. He was their authoritarian leader. The Germans loved the Kaiser. They had fought a war for him, and now he abdicates. And even more controversially, he's replaced by a new democracy that is initially associated with the end of the war. And the Germans thought they were winning the war, and yet this new democracy signs a peace treaty that is going to punish the Germans, and the Germans will lose territory, and the Germans will lose their military, and they'll have to accept the guilt War Guilt Clause 271 that they caused the war, and they're going to have to pay war reparations of $33 billion, and all of these articles of the Paris Peace Conference, which ends up being the Treaty of Versailles. All these articles will make the German people look at their own government and say, well, these are the November criminals. These guys stabbed us in the back. So early on, the Weimar Republic is going to be associated with turmoil, political turmoil, in the sense that there's going to be a lot of assassinations of these first democratically elected people. And then there's going to be some national turmoil, as some areas of Germany don't even recognize the government in Weimar. Why is it in Weimar? It's not in Berlin, because there's communists trying to take over Berlin. So that's another part of the story here, right? Is that there's so much fighting in the streets and division and polarization and revolutions and assassinations that there's not really a chance for democracy to establish itself, to grow roots. Economically, the democracy that is the Weimar Republic will be associated with hyperinflation in 1923. And because of hyperinflation, what we see in 1923, it's so absurd. So let's say December 1922. December 1922, one US dollar was 7,590 Reichsmarks. That's a lot. So from December 1918, it was like 8 Reichsmarks, or 8 marks for a US dollar. So there's an 8 to 1. So a mark at that time, it was 8.25. So a mark would be worth about 11 cents. But by December of 1922, you would need almost 7,600 marks for a US dollar. So what people were seeing is, okay, we have a democracy. What impact does that have on my economics, right? Politics is interesting, but economics is survival, right? That's how much money do I have? How much does food cost, and that sort of thing. What we're seeing is that the dollar, the German dollar, called a mark, is plummeting in value. So if you had savings, the relative purchasing power of your savings has been compromised by inflation. So that's December of 22. So in 4 years, it goes from 8 to 1 to 7,600 to 1. But what happens in the next year, from December 22 to December 23? 44 point. Wow, I can't even read this. It's so big. 4,200 billion. 4,200 billion. So in my mind, that's like 4.2 trillion, right? 4.2 trillion marks you need for one US dollar. So whatever savings you had, it's worthless. So economic turmoil, because of the outcome of World War I, because of the war reparations, because the French have occupied the industrial heartland of Germany, the Rhineland, the Ruhr, because the Germans have lost the Saar and key coal mines and stuff like that, Germany is in ruins. And people think that, you know what, we've been betrayed. And what does Adolf Hitler do? He promises them a return to glory. He says, I'm going to scrap the Treaty of Versailles. I'm going to bring the German family back together. We're going to go and take those lands where Germans are living, and the lands that have been stolen from us by the French, by the Czechs, by the Slovaks, by the Poles, by the Belgians, and we're going to get the family back together, and then we're going to expand. We're going to get Lebensraum, because we have our manifest destiny. The Americans have gone and conquered the Americas because they see themselves as the masters there. We're the masters here, and it's our time to control Europe. And people buy into that. They want to have hope. They want to see themselves as greater than they are. And he gives them a solution. So beginning in 1928, the Nazis, the National Socialists, they have 12 seats in the Reichstag. So the Reichstag at that time had 491 total seats, total deputies in the Reichstag. So 12 is very few. But what they have is a different electoral system than what we have. In Canada, we count the votes based upon horse races. So in order to have a seat in the House of Commons, you have to actually win a horse race, meaning that there's a riding, a constituency is what I'm trying to say. There's a riding, there's a constituency, and it's the It's the candidate in that constituency with the most votes that gets to have that seat in the House of Commons. So we'll have some parties federally, like the Libertarian Party, where they might get 1% of the total vote in Canada, but they don't get any seats. Even though 1% of 300 seats, maybe they should have 3 seats. Maybe Tim Moen should be in the House. But he's not, because he doesn't win his race. So in Canada, we have all these individual races, and you have to win your race to go to House of Commons. But in Germany, in the Weimar Republic, they had proportional representation. So if your party gets 1% of the vote, and we have 491 deputies, then you get like 5 seats. So the Germans, a fringe party, a reactionary party, a fringe party, they have 12 seats in 1928. But one of those seats is occupied by Adolf Hitler, and he's speaking, he's screaming, he gets the national stage. He has an audience, and from May of 28 to March of 1933, they go from 12 seats to 288 seats. So one of the reasons why the National Socialists were able to win an election in Germany, so how did they become the party in power democratically, which is not what Hitler wrote about in Mein Kampf, but one of the ways that they do this is because of the electoral system. The way that they counted the vote allowed a fringe party to have 12 seats. So the textbook goes and tells you the story of Germany. It talks about some of the key policies, unification of the Germans. Only Germans can be, only people that are ethnic, cultural Germans can be seen as citizens. All citizens must have an obligation to work for the state. We're going to, so there is some of this adherence to collective norms, right? That there's a Nazi vision. And adherence to collective norms is one of those principles of collectivism. That there's a way that Germans are meant to think and look and act. And that's part of adherence to collective norms. There will be some stuff, though, that looks like individualism. That under Hitler's policies, there's still private property. Oskar Schindler still owns the factory, but it's not capitalism as we'd expect it in America. It's a form of capitalism. It's authoritarian capitalism, where the government can go to those corporations that are privately owned and say, you're building me tanks. You're building me munition shells. You're building me weapons that we can use in my foreign policy to become stronger. So even though they have economic freedom, it's not as free as it is here. The state does, like they do in the Soviet Union, really coordinate the assets of the nation so that they can further their policies. Textbook also talks about, it jumps back to communism in the Soviet Union. So again, I don't like the way it jumps around. That's why when I teach this, we kind of, here's the Soviet story, here's the USSR, here's the Nazi story. But in the textbook, it jumps back to communism in the USSR. It talks about Stalin's 5-year plans now. So again, we have a revolution. And I have a video lecture on this that goes in way more detail, so I'm not gonna just go and reteach that here now. But we have a revolution that will lead to a civil war. The Reds under Lenin will win the civil war. Lenin's going to introduce 2 key policies we need to know about. During the civil war, he has war communism, which is basically the Red Army can come and take what they need to win the civil war. It is taking private property, making it public. It's very fitting with Marxism. But when that doesn't work and it leads to famine, and it also leads to some of his most loyal supporters turning on him, he says, I've tried to do too much too quickly, and he introduces the new economic policy, which is an injection of capitalism. Again, which is pretty important. Your authoritarian system's failing, so you're going to turn to individualism? That seems to be acknowledging that collectivism doesn't work. Ultimately, though, Lenin will die while in office, and eventually he's replaced by Stalin. So Lenin dies in 24, and by 28 we know Stalin's in charge. There's a gray area because one of the problems with authoritarianism politically, there's no easy transition of power. You know, in America, usually there's an easy transition of power, unless Donald Trump and his supporters are involved. But even that, it didn't delay the inevitable. We still have President Biden today, eating his ice cream and doing what he does, whatever that is. So in the Soviet story, we go from Lenin, and now we have Stalin in 1928, and we really need to know a lot about Stalin's economics. We really truly do, and that's why I have an additional article in the online resource for you to read about Stalin. But here's the key points. He's trying to, he acknowledges, this is the reason for it. He acknowledges that the USSR is 50 to 100 years behind, and they must make good the lag in 10 years or be crushed. So he believes that the Soviet Union will be invaded, and it will. And he believes the only way to solve that is to rapidly modernize and mechanize. How can he do that? He needs to take command of the three basic economic questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and how to allocate it. And the what, the how to produce and how to allocate it, or who to allocate it to, will all be organized through a central planned organization called Gosplan, Gosplan, Gosplan. And this is an example of a command economy. The government is commanding the economy. They're central planning the economy. They're answering the basic economic questions, and they're doing it so that they can potentially survive the coming attack. But he looks around and he says, how am I going to pay for this rapid industrialization, modernization, urbanization, this transformation? We're going to do the Industrial Revolution in 10 years. How can we do that? What do we have? And what do we have that we can use as a resource? And the answer is, well, we got some wheat in the Ukraine, which is one of the SSRs, the Soviet Socialist Republics. And he's like, yeah, let's take that wheat, and we're going to sell it, and we're going to get some money, and we're going to use that money to build factories. So what he does is he collectivizes farms. And when he collectivizes the Ukrainian kulak farms, it creates a famine, and at least 6 million kulaks and Ukrainian people will die. That's the Holodomor, which many people they associate, they contrast it with the Hitler's Holocaust. So we talk about the Holocaust all the time and the 6 million dead Jewish people, but maybe more than 7 million people died in this Ukrainian famine that was created out of the policies of the Soviet Union. Now, Machiavelli would say, maybe the ends justify the means. The end is that the Soviet Union survives. The means was we stole the farmland from these people, we nationalized it, and millions died. That's a pretty grim way of looking at it. Stalin also would add to that quote by saying, one death is a tragedy, but 1 million, that's a statistic. That's very harsh, right? That's very grim. Machiavelli would say it's better to be feared than loved, and Stalin was feared. Stalin's feared because he has a great purge in 1936 to 38, where more than 1 million people will be killed. He had a purge earlier in 1933 against his own political party, where he has those closest to him in power eliminated so that no one can question his policies. Very similar to Robespierre, right? Robespierre had his purge where he had Danton and Desmoulins killed. And this is a reoccurring theme that Hitler has the leader of the SA killed in his purge, the Night of Long Knives. So then the textbook talks about propaganda and gives some examples, and then it jumps back to Nazi Germany. And again, with regards to Nazi Germany, we have the techniques of dictatorship. It talks about Hitler's purge that I just mentioned against the leader of the SA in the Night of Long Knives. We also have references to how did Hitler go from a leader of a Democratic Party to a leader of a one-party state. And we have this moment in history, this Reichstag fire in February of 33, and how he reacts to it is he takes advantage of this crisis to consolidate power. Following the Reichstag fire, he will pass the Enabling Act. And he does this during a time of an election, and it allows him to use state power to control the opposition, to arrest his opponents. And even though they don't win a majority in the March election, following the March election, he will following the March election, he'll pass the Enabling Act. Before that, it was just emergency decrees that allowed him to to round up the opposition. So emergency decrees during February, round up the opposition, put some communists in jail, control the streets so that you can control the election, and then when he doesn't get a majority in the election, he passes or he invokes the Enabling Act. Now, I want you to know that it's not the first time in the Weimar history that this was done. But what it did was it allowed the executive branch to rule by decree for 4 years, and that act ended up making it into a one-party state. Once it was a one-party state, his goal was to achieve economic self-sufficiency, called autarky. And his idea was, if we are self-sufficient, if we don't need oil from another country, if we don't need coal from another country, then we can have the supplies here that we need to go and invade there. So autarky was goal one, so that he could go and invade others. What else do we associate with Adolf Hitler other than the Holocaust, other than eugenics? We also associate some mass projects like the Autobahn and the Volkswagen. And he tried to transform the lives of Aryan people by targeting youth with the Hitler Youth. He targeted mothers by giving them like little pins that said, you're the mother of the Reich, because you've done something honorable, you've had lots of kids, that sort of thing. There was dissent against him. There were people that tried to oppose him. For example, there was a group that opposed him called the White Rose, but they would be hunted and persecuted, and many of them had to work in the shadows. When Hitler makes all other parties illegal, and when he ends up controlling all aspects of life, he introduces a policy. It's not in the textbook. I talk about it in my lesson called Gleichschaltung, and it's spelt for you in my lesson. It basically makes everything Nazi. You're part of a gardener club, it's going to be a Nazi gardener club. You're part of a union, it's a Nazi union. You have a bowling club, it's a Nazi bowling club. So Nazis became this ocean that everybody swam in constantly. And because he controlled the Nazi party, and because everything became Nazi, he controlled everything. So, what is the point of Chapter 5? At the end of Chapter 5, you should understand why communism comes to Russia. You should understand why the German people turned back to authoritarianism. That's one thing. You should also be able to talk about, what are some techniques that authoritarian leaders use to seize power and then to maintain power. So force, terror, intimidation, propaganda, this all helps them seize power. Once they're in power, how do they maintain it? Maybe indoctrination, maybe secret police, maybe pageantry and controlled participation, scapegoats, things like that. We also want you to compare and contrast the ideologies. So one is radical, one's reactionary. What does that mean? What is the goal? The fascists are trying to create inequality. The communists are trying to create egalitarianism, equality, right? So that's kind of key here as well. Another key is, what did they actually physically do? What were their policies? And again, Stalin's policies are summed up with looking at the idea of command economics, centrally planned economy, means the same thing. Gosplan, 5-year plans. We have to rapidly industrialize, mechanize, and modernize so that we can survive the coming attack. That's the Stalin side of the story that you'll read more about in my article. The Hitler side of the story, he also has these big projects like the Autobahn, the Volkswagen, but instead of nationalizing the key industries, he allows them to maintain private because he needs the industrialists to be his supporters, but he still tells them what they're allowed to do. So that's a look at the chapter. The chapter is a good chapter. If you have a textbook, read it. If you don't have a textbook, I have notes in our online resource, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview.